Abby thought she had found the perfect escape. Just one man, a few dates, and all her problems would disappear. And for a while, it worked. But now, her best friend is missing, and a single phone call is about to plunge her into a deadly game where the stakes are life or death. Where did all these come from? How did things get so bad? It all started with the day she came to terms with the fact that she needed more money. The day her nightmares began. Abby stared at the screen of her phone, the numbers in her bank account mocking her. She had been trying to make things work, balancing part-time jobs with a full course load, skipping meals, saying no to social events because she couldn't afford the luxury of fun. But it was never enough. The weight of her financial struggles had become suffocating, a relentless pressure that seemed to tighten with each passing day. Her roommate, Susan, had always been different, carefree, effortlessly confident, someone who floated through life without the heavy burden of worry that plagued Abby. It wasn't that Susan didn't care about Abby's struggles. She did, in her own way. But Susan's view of the world was skewed by her own comfort, by the ease with which life seemed to unfold for her. She believed there was always a solution, and for Susan, that solution often came in the form of a man. Why struggle when there are people willing to make your life easier? Susan had once said, her voice casual, almost dismissive of Abby's concerns. Abby hadn't thought much of it then, but now, those words lingered, echoing louder each time she saw a new bill she couldn't pay. It wasn't that Abby didn't want to be independent, to make it on her own, but the grind was wearing her down. And when Susan's suggestion resurfaced, it came not as a joke or passing thought, but as something more tempting. Susan had said it so simply. Find someone who could help, someone who cared, but who also had the means to ease the burdens weighing Abby down. It started as a seed, a tiny thought that Abby had pushed away at first, but the seed grew, feeding on her exhaustion and her desperation. Susan planned it more, though she did so subtly. You deserve better, she would say. You're too good to be working yourself to death. Soon, Abby began to believe it. She convinced herself that it wasn't about using someone. It was about finding stability. It was about being with someone who would love her, who would want to take care of her. Slowly, the idea stopped feeling so wrong. She wasn't hurting anyone after all. People had relationships for all sorts of reasons. Why couldn't she allow herself this? But as the thought settled deeper into her mind, Abby didn't realize how far she was drifting from who she used to be. It happened so gradually, so quietly, that by the time she noticed, it was too late to turn back. She didn't see the danger. Not then. There was no sudden moment where everything changed, no single event that tipped her over the edge. Just a series of small choices, each one a little easier to make than the last. Each one leading her down a path she wouldn't understand until it was too late. This wasn't the story of a girl who was saved by someone's love. It was a story of a girl who had once been strong enough to stand on her own, but had allowed herself to be swept away by promises that weren't real. And in the end, the cost of that choice would be more than she could ever imagine. But at that point, she thought she had it all figured out. She was going to get herself a sugar daddy. After weeks of pushing the idea away, Abby found herself creating a profile on a sugar daddy website one night, Susan's words echoing in her mind. It felt strange, even a little shameful, but the thought of relief, of finally not worrying about how she'd make rent or pay for her textbooks, was stronger than her hesitation. She clicked through profiles, some of the men looking every bit their age, their photos filled with expensive suits and forced smiles. Nothing really stood out until she matched with Roland. Roland wasn't like the others. He was retired, yes, and at 65 years old, he should have looked like the rest, graying, maybe a little worn down by life. But Roland's photo showed a man who looked a decade or two younger. He had strong, defined features and a body that hinted at hours in the gym rather than years behind a desk. His smile was charming, his words smooth, and there was an ease about him that caught Abby's attention right away. They started messaging, and soon, he asked her out. She hesitated for a moment, the whole idea still feeling foreign. But when she met him in person, all her worries melted away. Roland was charming in real life too, polite, attentive, the perfect gentleman. He asked about her studies, her dreams, and unlike the men she imagined from this kind of sight, he seemed genuinely interested in her life. And just like Susan had predicted, the financial stress that had weighed Abby down for so long began to disappear. Roland insisted on paying for everything, her tuition, rent, groceries, even the occasional shopping spree. At first, Abby felt guilty, but he never made it seem transactional. "I want to take care of you," he'd say, his voice warm, soothing. Their relationship seemed almost too good to be true. Roland wasn't just generous. He was respectful, kind, and attentive. He opened doors, remembered her favorite coffee order, and always made sure she was comfortable. Abby found herself relaxing for the first time in months, letting go of the constant pressure. It was everything Susan had said it would be. And for a while, Abby let herself believe she'd found the perfect arrangement. But slowly, small cracks began to show. At first, it was harmless enough. Roland would text her often, asking how her day was going. Abby thought it was sweet. He liked to check in, and she liked that he cared. But as the weeks passed, the messages became more frequent, almost hourly. He'd call when she was in class, and if she didn't answer, he'd leave a voicemail, his voice soft but firm, asking why she hadn't picked up. He started asking about her schedule, wanting to know who she was with, what she was doing, and where she was going every time they weren't together. At first, Abby brushed it off. He was older, maybe just more protective than the guys her age. She figured it was his way of showing affection, of making sure she was safe. But over time, it started to feel suffocating. One day, she had plans to meet Susan for lunch. When Roland called and asked what she was doing, she casually mentioned it. His tone shifted, the warmth draining from his voice. "Susan again?" he asked, a hint of irritation seeping through. It was small, barely noticeable, but enough to unsettle Abby. Then there were the surprise visits. He'd show up outside her classes, waiting for her with that same charming smile. At first, she thought it was a romantic gesture. Who wouldn't want their boyfriend surprising them? But the more he did it, the more it felt like he was watching her, always knowing where she was, even when she hadn't told him. Abby began to pull back, creating distance where she could. She didn't always answer his calls right away, made excuses when he wanted to see her too often. But Roland noticed. He always noticed. He'd show up unexpectedly, claiming he was just in the area, or he'd text more insistently, asking why she hadn't responded sooner. What had once felt like security now felt like a trap. Roland wasn't the easygoing, perfect gentleman he had seemed. Beneath that polished exterior was something darker, something possessive that Abby couldn't quite shake. The more she tried to step back, the tighter his grip seemed to get. Abby began to worry she had let herself fall too deep, and the ease she had once felt was replaced by a growing sense of unease. She didn't know how to get out of this, but something told her that Roland wouldn't let go without a fight. Things had started to change after Abby met Alex. He was a guy from her class, laid back and sweet, the kind of person who made her laugh without trying. Unlike Roland, Alex didn't complicate her life. There were no strings attached, no constant questions about where she was or who she was with. He just wanted to be with her. They started dating, and for the first time in a while, Abby felt like she could breathe. It wasn't long before Roland found out, though she hadn't told him. He had a way of knowing things, of piecing together the smallest details. It started with subtle hints, questions about her day that seemed to probe deeper than before, or offhand comments that made her feel like he was watching her more closely. Abby tried to brush it off, to pretend everything was fine, but she knew deep down Roland wouldn't let her move on so easily. One afternoon, she and Alex were at his place, enjoying the rare quiet. They were sitting on the couch, a movie playing in the background, when they heard a loud, sharp bang at the door. The sound was so sudden, so violent, that Abby jumped. Alex stood up immediately, grabbing a baseball bat he kept by the door, his face tense. "Stay here," he said, moving toward the noise. Abby's heart pounded in her chest as she sat frozen on the couch, dread filling her. Something in the pit of her stomach told her this wasn't just a random visitor. She heard the door creak open, and then a deep voice, Roland's voice. Within seconds, chaos erupted. Roland pushed past Alex, fury blazing in his eyes. Behind him, two other men, henchmen, bodyguards, whoever they were, stormed in. Alex tried to fight them off with the bat, but it was no use. They overwhelmed him, knocking him to the ground as Roland watched, his face calm, almost detached. Abby stood, paralyzed, as Roland's men beat Alex, their fists raining down on him while he tried to defend himself. Roland turned to Abby, his eyes softening as if the violence happening before him didn't matter. His voice was calm, almost tender. "Why are you doing this to me, Abby?" he asked, taking a step toward her. "I love you. You know that. I don't want anyone else to have you." It was then that Abby realized Roland was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. His possessiveness wasn't just a quirk, it was a sickness, something dark and twisted that had been hiding behind his charming exterior all along. The realization hit her like a wave, and her survival instincts kicked in. Without thinking, Abby turned and ran. She sprinted out of Alex's house, her heart racing, not daring to look back. By the time she reached her apartment, her legs were shaking and her chest was heaving. She burst through the door, startling Susan, who had been lounging on the couch. "I need to get out of this," Abby panted, her voice shaking. "Roland, he's insane. He just attacked Alex." Susan's face paled, her usual nonchalance replaced with genuine concern. "You need to end this," she said, her voice firm. "You have to break it off with him. He's dangerous, Abby." Abby nodded, but fear had already settled deep within her. She could feel it gnawing at her insides, making her wonder if breaking things off with Roland would be as simple as it sounded. Neither of them was ready for what came next. What had started as a means of survival was spiraling into something far darker, something she could no longer control. The next day, Abby stayed inside the apartment, the weight of the previous night's events pressing heavily on her chest. She couldn't focus on anything, not even the faint light filtering through the blinds. Susan had gone to class that morning, offering Abby a reassuring smile before leaving. But now evening was creeping in, and Susan still hadn't come back. Abby tried to convince herself that it was fine. Susan could be hanging out with friends or caught up in schoolwork. But a gnawing fear, the same fear that had been building ever since Roland attacked Alex, wouldn't let her rest. She checked her phone for the 100th time, but there were no messages from Susan. Finally, her anxiety got the best of her. She dialed Susan's number, her fingers trembling. The phone rang once, twice, and then someone answered, but it wasn't Susan. A deep, cold voice greeted her on the other end. "Hello, Abby." Abby's blood froze. She knew the voice immediately. "Roland." Her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. Her throat felt tight as her mind raced. "Good guess." His voice was calm, too calm. "Susan's with me. What do you want?" Abby's heart pounded in her chest. Panic clawed at her, making it hard to breathe. "Where is she?" Roland's tone shifted, becoming darker. "Come to my house now. Alone. If you call the police, if you try anything," he paused, and the silence on the other end of the line made Abby's skin crawl. "I'll kill her, and then I'll come for you." The line went dead, leaving Abby standing in stunned silence. She stared at the phone in her hand, unable to think, unable to process what had just happened. Roland had Susan. Without a second thought, Abby grabbed her jacket and bolted out the door. Her mind was spinning with fear, guilt, and regret. She should have listened to Susan when she'd warned her to break things off with Roland sooner. She should have seen how dangerous he was before it was too late. Now Susan was paying for her mistake. It was dark by the time Abby arrived at Roland's house, her breath heavy, her heart pounding. The mansion loomed ominously against the night sky. The gate opened like a mouth ready to swallow her whole. There was no going back now. She had to get Susan out of there, no matter what. She pushed through the front door, which creaked open easily. The dimly lit foyer was quiet, too quiet. Abby's footsteps echoed as she cautiously stepped inside, scanning the shadows for any sign of Roland. Her pulse thudded in her ears, drowning out all rational thought. "Roland," she called out, her voice trembling as it broke the silence. Suddenly, she heard movement upstairs. She followed the sound, her heart in her throat, as she ascended the winding staircase. Her hands shook, every muscle in her body tense, as she reached the second floor. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out. Abby crept toward it, her stomach twisting with dread. She pushed the door open. Inside, she found Susan, bound to a chair in the center of the room, her head slumped forward. Her wrists were tied tightly, her face bruised and bloodied. Abby's heart shattered at the sight of her best friend, broken and beaten. "Susan," Abby rushed forward, dropping to her knees in front of her. But as soon as she touched Susan, the horrifying truth hit her. She was too late. Susan wasn't breathing. Her skin was cold, lifeless. Abby's shaking hands fumbled as she checked for a pulse. But there was nothing. Susan was gone. A choked sob escaped Abby's throat. The guilt was suffocating. wrapping itself around her chest and squeezing until she couldn't breathe. This was all her fault. She had brought Roland into their lives, and now Susan was dead because of it. A slow clap echoed from the shadows, and Abby spun around to see Roland standing in the doorway, his eyes dark, his expression cold. "You're too late," he said, his voice chillingly matter-of-fact. He stepped closer, the tension in the room thickening with each slow, deliberate step. "I told you, Abby. I told you what would happen if you tried to pull away." Tears blurred her vision as she rose to her feet, rage and fear coursing through her veins. "You killed her," Roland shrugged, his calm demeanor completely detached from the horror he had just caused. "She was in the way. You belong to me, Abby. I warned you, but you didn't listen." Abby's hands shook as her eyes darted around the room. Her gaze fell on a lamp sitting on the nightstand, a heavy metal lamp. Without thinking, she grabbed it and hurled it at Roland, her anger blinding her. It hit him squarely in the chest, and he staggered back, caught off guard. Abby didn't wait. She lunged at him, fists pounding, screaming, her grief exploding in uncontrollable fury. Roland fought back, shoving her hard, sending her crashing into the wall. The impact knocked the wind out of her, but she scrambled to her feet, adrenaline surging through her. "You won't get away with this," she screamed. Roland smirked, wiping blood from his mouth. "Who's going to stop me?" In the corner of the room, Abby spotted a knife, left on a small table, as if it had been placed there on purpose. Without hesitation, she lunged for it, but Roland was faster. He grabbed her wrist, twisting it painfully until she cried out and the knife fell from her grasp. He shoved her to the ground again, looming over her, his expression finally betraying the madness underneath. "I loved you," he hissed, "and you betrayed me." In one swift movement, Roland picked up the knife, his eyes gleaming with a terrifying resolve. Abby struggled to get up, but she was too weak, her body battered and exhausted. She could see the end coming. And then, with chilling finality, Roland plunged the knife into her chest. Abby gasped, pain searing through her body. She fell to the floor, her vision fading as blood pooled around her. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was Roland's cold, emotionless face as he stood over her. In the silence of that room, Abby's world went black, and the deadly grip of Roland's obsession claimed its final victim.